Mr. King, thank you so much for joining us and offering us the opportunity to hear from you, both as we mark the anniversary of your father's birth, as well as the anniversary of Rabbi Dr. Heschel's passing 50 years ago. This is an opportunity for us to hear from you, to think about what it is that you feel is important for the fans, friends, and family of Rabbi Dr. Heschel to be thinking about at this time. Any thoughts that you'd like to share with us tonight?
Well, certainly. Thank you for the opportunity. And as I think about Rabbi Heschel and what he meant to the modern day civil rights movement as one of the greatest scholars of our time, first of all, but a leader who perhaps understood that the world is diverse and has a lot of different people and a lot of issues. And yet when injustice occurred, he felt compelled to join my father in Selma, Alabama. They certainly had dialogue and discussions and march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I think many in our nation saw that what I would call coalition leadership. The irony is 50 years later, we need desperately that kind of leadership today because our nation is drifting apart as opposed to thinking, how do we work together? Dad and Rabbi Heschel, I believe, taught that we can disagree without being disagreeable. And yet we don't see that scenario as much as we'd like to today. We see people at each other's neck. And obviously that will not serve our nation or our world in the most responsible way. We need leadership like Rabbi Heschel, and it is so missed in our nation today.
You know, we're sitting here. You're with us. We have Professor Susannah Heschel is one of our speakers later on in our program. Any wishes for her family as they're thinking about their father and your father, of course, tonight together as well?
Well, you know, first of all, to Dr. Susannah Heschel, we have great love. Our family has great love and respect for her. We have marched and maybe sometimes demonstrated together over the years, and she means so much. Her voice is extraordinarily significant in this day and time. In a sense, just as I believe I'm doing what I can to follow in the tradition of my father and mother, she also is following in the tradition of her family, and an outstanding voice in a world that, and sometimes it feels very lonely, but I certainly always wish her the best and have tremendous love and affection for her, and especially at this time, as it is 50 years at the loss of her father.
I want to thank you, and I want to thank you in the way of Jewish tradition, which is to offer a blessing. You spoke about peace. You didn't just speak about a piece of calm, but a piece of a fight for something that's important. And so I want to bless you and your family as we remember your father this weekend, with the sense that we should all continue to fight together for something that is greater and something that is good for us all. So thank you so much, and blessings.
All right, same to you. So good to talk to you. Hope to actually meet you someday.
That would be lovely.
All right, blessings to you.
Blessings. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shalom and good evening, everyone. My name is Rabbi Yonah Berman, YCP class of 2007. And on behalf of Yeshivat Hovevei Torah here in New York City, it's an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to A Modern Prophet, an evening of reflection and learning marking 50 years since the passing of Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel. For those of you who would like to take full advantage of our live closed captioning and American Sign Language interpretation services, you can press the globe button at the bottom of your screen, which will allow you to choose various options. We thank Matisse and Mark Aronson for their ongoing wisdom and support, and for their continued efforts in helping make so much public programming here at YCT accessible to as many people as possible. Tonight's program is part of YCT's ongoing efforts to bring the Torah of values and inclusion to the Jewish community as a whole, and specifically to the Orthodox community. This is an area where we've become leaders through the work of over 200 rabbinic alumni, rabbinical students and faculty, as well as here on Zoom over the past few years. And we're grateful to so many of you, individuals around the world, for your encouragement and partnership tonight and on so many other occasions. We thank over 30 institutional partners from across the United States and Canada and across the globe and Israel, whose assistance has been invaluable in bringing this program to light. We'll send out a full list of partners as part of our upcoming email thanking you all for joining us tonight. The program is also being recorded, so if you hear from anyone that they're having some trouble logging on, don't worry, it's available, and we'll make sure we get it to them as well. Tonight's program is being sponsored by my father, Dr. Jeffrey Berman, along with our other members of our family and friends of our family, as we prepare to mark the 13th yahrzeit of my mother, Bonnie Lax Berman, Aleha Shalom, whose 71st birthday would have been today. I cannot think of a more appropriate way to remember her and her legacy than to tie it in some way to that of Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel. My mother was a humanitarian who sought to bring different groups together through the various volunteer efforts with which she was involved. She truly loved the Sabbath, and she truly appreciated the power of prayer. Like Rabbi Dr. Heschel, she epitomized the words associated in Ethics of Our Fathers, Pirkei Avot, with Aharon, the brother of Moses, both of whom we read so much about in our Torah portions this past week. Ahava shalom v'ratfa shalom, ahavat habriot v'kervan la Torah. She's someone who loved peace, who sought peace. She loved all of creation and sought to bring creation close to Torah. While the program will go past 10 p.m. Eastern, it's being recorded, as I mentioned, and the link will be available soon for those of you who require it. So if you need to log off early, don't worry, you'll get to watch later. Tonight's schedule will include a short greeting from Rabbi Avi Weiss, followed by words of introduction from my friend and colleague, Rabbi Seth Winberg, who will introduce Rabbi Saul Berman, who had many first-hand encounters with Rabbi Dr. Heschel. Following Rabbi Berman, we'll hear from Professor Susannah Heschel, and then move on to a panel of younger rabbinic leaders. We'll talk about the next 50 years of Rabbi Dr. Heschel's legacy. Throughout the program and at its end, we'll have an opportunity to see short tribute videos from various rabbis, Rabbaniot, all of whom have felt inspired by Rabbi Heschel's influence throughout their careers of service to the Jewish people. Continue now with the short video from Rabbi Avi Weiss.
Go down, Moses, O Davinu Chai. Speaking to the uniqueness of Dr. Heschel, who interfaced activism with brilliant, soulful theology, I'd like to focus on 3 ways that his activism was unique. First of all, Dr. Heschel understood the importance of speaking out and marching for universal causes, and so he marched with Dr. King. But in the same breath, he never forgot the needs of his own people. All the way back in 1963, he was the voice at the seminary, encouraging rabbinic students, encouraging rabbis of congregations of their responsibility to speak out for the freedom of Soviet Jewry. In his words, if we are ready to go to jail in order to destroy the blight of racial bigotry, if we are ready to march off to Washington in order to demonstrate our identification with those who are deprived of equal rights, should we not be ready to go to jail in order to end the martyrdom of our Russian brethren? Dr. Heschel lived the words of Hillel, Ulshani latzmi ma'ani, if I'm only for myself, what am I worth? But in the same breath, Imena Nili Mili, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? He recognized that we should be doing no less for ourselves than we should do for others. And secondly, it was Dr. Heschel who spoke of the importance of recognizing that as we become older, those older years, as he said at the White House in 1961, could be our most formative years. And he lived that legacy. His activism really came together in his mid-50s, late 50s. He died much too young in his mid-60s. He taught that message. No matter how old we are, we have something to contribute. We can even march in those years. And thirdly, Heschel, Dr. Heschel, was a gadol. He was a Rosh Yeshiva's Rosh Yeshiva. How many men and women who fall into that category, how many would march with a Dr. King? How many would speak out for Soviet Jewries in such eloquent terms? And so a bracha that we live his legacy. We live his name of Avraham Vayikra b'Shem Hashem, the way Heschel spoke out and walked with God, that lone voice often, and in the spirit of Yehoshua, of Chazak ve'ematz. What a unique honor it is in the presence of you, Susannah, to say these words about a man whom I unfortunately never met, but has touched my soul in such a deep way. May he continue to inspire us to do all we can to impact Am Yisrael and to change the world.
A highlight of my years in the yeshiva, in addition to being a classmate of Rabbi Yonah Berman, was the presence in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Saul Berman and the times I spent in his study and walking with him on Shabbat afternoons. Rabbi Berman served shuls in Berkeley, Brookline, and Manhattan. He's currently professor of Jewish studies at Stern College and on the faculty of Columbia University Law School. He asked for a short introduction, so please join me in welcoming a true Rav Sheba Rabbanim, a rabbi of intellectual rigor and spiritual depth, Mori Rabbi Saul Berman.
So thank you very much for the for the introduction and for its brevity. It's really my honor to speak this evening in memory of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. It is also my honor to speak in memory of Rabbi Yonah Berman's mother, who passed away also much too early. I'd like to just acknowledge the presence of Rabbi Dov Linzer, who's the Rosh Yeshiva of YCT. And I'm sure there are many others whom I know, but I can't really see all of you. I think on my screen, I can only see a maximum of 25 people at a time. So, in my years of study with Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik at Yeshiva University, I learned that when a Talmid Chacham responds to social policy or even to political issues, that there's a halacha embedded in the response, that there are halachic principles and values and ideals that are available to be discovered that served as the Jewish grounding for the position that the Chacham is taking. So in March of 1965, I was serving already as the rabbi for a number of years already as the rabbi of Congregation Beth Israel in Berkeley. And I had the good fortune to have numbers of occasions of meetings with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, because he used to get invited with some degree of frequency to speak to the Jewish faculty at Berkeley. And I also had the opportunity to hear him speak at Stanford University in at least one of the lectures that constituted part of the book that was subsequently published under the name of Who is Man? So at that time in March 1965, my conservative colleagues told me that Rabbi Heschel was encouraging rabbis to go to Selma pursuant to a call by Martin Luther King Jr. In order to engage in voting rights efforts and to participate in the planned march from Selma to Montgomery. And I decided to go. I decided to go knowing that I, first of all, would miss being with my congregation on Tanit Esther and Purim. Also knowing that my motivation in going was not my liberal politics. My politics were not quite as liberal then as they subsequently became. But that I had a deep sense of awareness of the Jewish motivation in making this trip, and I left with the congregation a message to be read to them about that motivation. But there was something else that I knew I wanted to do in that trip, and that is that I decided that if Rabbi Heschel wanted rabbis to be there, then there must be something not only in his understanding of general social responsibility, but there must be something really powerful in Jewish philosophical and in halachic underpinnings for this kind of participation. That somehow these acts that we would be engaged in, the activities, the actions that we would be engaged in, needed to manifest to us something about the nature of our religious convictions and about halachic expression. So what I would like to do with you this evening is to share with you a number of the experiences that I had while I was in Selma, and with those experiences, the elements of the halachic underpinnings and lessons that I learned about halacha through those experiences. So the first thing that I would like to talk to you about was sort of an event that took place almost immediately after our arrival at the airport in Montgomery. Upon our arrival, we were told that we would be taken, there were a group of 5 of us, 5 rabbis from Northern California. There were 3 Reform rabbis, 1 conservative rabbi, and 20% of all of the Orthodox rabbis in Northern California. That was me. There were 5 of us at that point in time, Orthodox rabbis in the whole of Northern California. And since I had decided to go, it meant that 20% of all of the Orthodox rabbis in Northern California were on this particular trip. Unfortunately, I'm the last survivor of the 5 of us. And so the tales that I will tell you need to serve also as a reminder that there were others with me who put their lives into the same situation that I did. We were told that we would be driven from Montgomery to Selma in a caravan of cars. The reason for the caravan was that over the course of the preceding 10 years, from 1955 until 1965, somewhere between 50 and 100 people active in civil rights on behalf of Blacks had been murdered. Numbers of them on that road from Montgomery to Selma. What would often happen in the year leading up to the march from Montgomery to Selma is that as white activists would come to Montgomery and then be driven by local Blacks from Montgomery to Selma, if they were driving alone in a car, it would often be the case that suddenly they would find a car slowing down directly in front of them and another car tailgating them, so that the car would be pinned between those 2 cars. Those 2 cars would come to a stop, forcing the car in the middle to come to a stop. people would get out of the car in front and the car in back, would drag whites and blacks out of the cars, beat them, and leave them on the side of the road. And so in order to avoid that happening, particularly during this period of heightened violence, that was the months of February and March in 1965, cars only transported whites and blacks together when they traveled in large caravans. It just so happened that the driver of the car that I and one other colleague of mine were in was driven by an uncle of Jimmy Lee Jackson. Jimmy Lee Jackson had been murdered just approximately 5 weeks earlier. Those of you who saw the movie Selma may recall the fact. Some of you may even recall having read at one point or another about Jimmy Lee Jackson. He and his mother and his grandfather had participated in a demonstration related to voting rights. The demonstration was broken up through extreme violence, and all of the people at the demonstration began to flee in different directions. Jimmy Lee Jackson and his mother and grandfather ran off in one particular direction, thought that they had escaped the police who were following them, and then found themselves near a small cafe. They went into the cafe, sat down at the table to order something and to catch their breath. They didn't know that they were in fact being followed, and moments later, 2 police officers entered the cafe. They saw Jimmy Lee Jackson, his mother and grandfather sitting at the table. They approached the table, and one of them began to beat Jimmy Lee Jackson's mother, knocked her down onto the floor. And Jimmy Lee Jackson, having been trained somewhat in passive resistance, understood at that moment already that his best chance of protecting his mother was not to attack the police officer, because that would be most likely to end in both of their deaths, namely himself and his mother, but that instead what he needed to do was to throw himself down over his mother's body to cover her, to protect her from the blows that the officer was inflicting, which is what he did. The officer became infuriated at at this interference with his administration of justice, and informed Jimmy Lee Jackson that he has to get off her, and that if he doesn't get off her immediately, he would shoot her. He would shoot him. He stayed in place, and the officer shot and then rolled Jimmy Lee Jackson off his mother to resume beating the mother. The other police officer realized that things had gotten a little bit too far, and he told the first police officer that they had better call an ambulance. The first police officer said no, not interested, let him die right there on the spot. The first officer said, listen, if he dies, then there's going to be an inquest and there'll be all sorts of problems. We better call an ambulance. The first officer agreed. He got on the phone or whatever it was that he was using to communicate, and he said, he called a dispatcher, and he said, send an ambulance over here. We have a black on the ground who was shot resisting arrest. So some 15 minutes later, an ambulance arrived. The EMTs came out of the ambulance, slowly, leisurely manner, came inside, asked what had happened, found out what had happened, had a disagreement between them as to whether they should bother taking him into the hospital at all, because he's clearly going to die. They finally decided they better take him in. They brought in a stretcher, loaded him onto the stretcher, carried him out to the ambulance, and then drove off to the hospital at normal traffic speed, stopping at every stoplight, which was a report that they later got from observers as well. By the time they arrived at the hospital, it was too late to save his life. He died the next day. Now, I had heard of Jimmy Lee Jackson's death. I had known also that in the subsequent weeks, actually in the week just before our arrival in Selma, Reverend Reeb, a Unitarian minister from Boston, was also killed, was murdered outside a bar in Selma when the people in the bar had heard that he had come to participate in voting rights demonstrations. They followed him out of the bar and just beat him to death out in the street. So the level of violence that was then present in the entire area was really quite extraordinary. And what Jimmy Lee Jackson did is what Jimmy Lee Jackson needed to do, which is to protect the life of his mother, which was being threatened directly and unequivocally by the police officer. And of course, just in my thinking about that as we continue this drive, and then sort of subsequently as well, it was clear to me that this duty of protecting the lives of people whose lives are at significant risk is a fundamental Jewish responsibility. The halakha itself demands of us, not only in the verse in Leviticus of Lo Tamer al Dam Re'echa in chapter 19, the verse which commands not to stand by the threat of death to one's neighbor, to re'acha, which is usually understood as a reference to fellow Jews, but that the Torah itself, in the subsequent chapter in Vayikra, in chapter 25 of Leviticus, in verse 35, goes further and insists that that duty of rescue of life is applicable to the stranger, to the resident alien, essentially universalizing that general principle, and that is in fact recorded that way by Nachmanides, by Ramban, in his commentary to Maimonides' list of the commandments, as well as in his commentary to this passage in the Torah itself, where Nachmanides maintains that this verse, the verse in chapter 25, verse 35, if your brother be waxen poor and his means fail with him, you shall uphold him. Ger v'toshav, whether he be a stranger or a resident alien, v'chai imach, that they be able to live amongst you. Nachmanides insists that this constitutes the affirmative divine command of the duty of rescue of the life of any person. Now, of course, he has a slight qualification to that. His qualification is that idolaters would not have to have their lives saved. Who idolaters are is a matter of significant debate in the history of halakha. Let me put it in the simplest possible way. In the common understanding of the position of Ramban, as well as that of Meiri and variety and Rambam himself, what that means is that if in 1939 you happened to be vacationing in Switzerland and Hitler happened to be vacationing in the same hotel and was swimming in the pool as you entered it and you saw that he was drowning, that you would have no legal duty to rescue him, despite the fact that he had the same Tzelem Elokim that you have, the same image of God, that you could not deny that he was created in the image of God, but you would have no duty to rescue his life because he had made himself into an outlaw, in the sense in which early Westerns in the United States used the term outlaw, someone who is not offered the protections of the law. His life is forfeit. And so in the language of Meiri, there are people in this world whose conduct is such that they forfeit the protection that the law would otherwise offer to them through their conduct. But that all other human beings, like the most human beings in the world are protected, as it were, and their lives need to be protected. And we bear a duty to protect them. Nachmanides himself insists that this is likewise the position of Maimonides. And in fact, Maimonides does include this duty of rescue of life as part of the general duty of charitable action toward others, in which he includes fully all non-Jews, including the resident alien, the observers of 7 Noahide commandments. All civilized human beings are entitled to that protection, even according to Maimonides. You know, it seems there was no question. I mean, at that point in time, there was no question that Black lives were cheap. I mean, think about Jimmy Lee Jackson for a moment. Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed in the presence of many witnesses. Everyone knew who had killed him. No one was charged with his murder. No one was charged with Jimmy Lee Jackson's murder until May of 2007. From 1965 until 2007, no one was charged. At that point, 42 years later, Bernard Fowler was indicted, pleaded guilty in a plea deal in November of 2010, and only then in 2010 was sentenced for his murder to 6 months in jail. But of course, not only in 1965 that it was obvious that the lives of some people in our society were cheaper than the lives of others. I mean, I would offer simply a simple current example, not even an issue of police brutality. Lifespan. The average lifespan of Blacks today in the United States is 7 years less than the average lifespan of whites. And the part of this country that has the highest disparity in lifespan between whites and Blacks is, guess where? Washington, D.C., our national capital, where the disparity in lifespan is 13 years. It has always seemed to me, you know, very strange to hear Jews sometimes complain about the people calling out that Black Lives Matter. You know, and there are Jews who have told me that they feel it's wrong to call out that Black Lives Matter. All lives matter. It's obviously true that all lives matter. But when a particular segment of the population is finding itself under greater threat than others, then it's appropriate to call attention to the fact that that greater threat exists. It's no different, I must tell you, from something that many, if not most of you are probably aware of. In 1956, when Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote one of his famous essays, Kol Dodito Fake, recording sort of the calls to the Jewish people to restore autonomy in the land of Israel and to restore in the fullness of the covenant with God. And one of those knockings that was heard, said Rabbi Soloveitchik, was around the time of the birth of the state of Israel, when the world learned Shedam Yehudi Eino Hefker, that Jewish blood was not hefker, that Jewish blood was not valueless, was not cheap. So does anyone think that Rabbi Soloveitchik did not believe that all human beings have the same Tzelem Elokim? He certainly did. Do any of you think that Rabbi Soloveitchik did not believe that there was a responsibility to act in defense of the lives of any human being whether it's according to the Ramban or according to the Rambam, whatever derivation one has for that proposition, he definitely did and spoke about that openly. And nobody ever accused Rabbi Soloveitchik of having misspoken, that he should not have said that Jewish lives are not cheap. He should have said that all human lives are not cheap, because it's obvious to anyone with a fair mind that when the lives of a particular segment of the population are at greater risk, then the society needs to call out that reality and needs to be ready to act in a manner that shows that it recognizes that that's an injustice that should not be tolerated. And it doesn't matter whether that's the minority of Christians who are being persecuted in Arab countries, or the minority of Muslims who are being persecuted in India. It doesn't matter where the persecution is. When there is persecution of a minority, then there's a responsibility to call out. When there is greater risk to the lives of a minority, then we have to call that out. I'd like to share with you a second event that I experienced in Selma, which also led me to think a lot about sort of what Torah teaches us. I and a group of about 150 people, including my colleague from Berkeley, Rabbi Jacob Gumbiner, of blessed memory, who was then the Hillel rabbi at University of California at Berkeley. We were arrested for engaging in a demonstration outside the house of the new mayor of Selma. There was some thinking in the civil rights community that Mayor Smitherman might be somewhat more open to compromise and to assuring that people would be entitled to vote. And this was a demonstration that was taking place in the white neighborhood of Selma, which was generally very carefully protected. And we were arrested at that demonstration. We were brought to the police station, and we were being held through the rest of that day. It was the day of Tanit Esther. That evening was the beginning of Purim. Another time, maybe I'll tell you the story about how I ended up being able to, one of the other rabbis who was with us actually brought me my Megillah that I had brought with me from Berkeley, so that I would be able to read the Megillah on that night, and which we did in prison with about 150, mostly non-Jews, but a significant segment of young Jews who had come from all over the United States in order to participate in these demonstrations, for many of whom it was the first time that they were hearing any part of the Megillah read. Later that evening, a police officer came into the room and asked for a Rabbi Gumbiner. Rabbi Gumbiner happened to be sitting right next to me. The police officer happened to know me because I had been called out earlier. And in any case, Rabbi Gumbiner did not want to identify himself. The police officer sort of guessed that he was the man sitting next to me, and asked him if he was Rabbi Gumbiner, to which he said yes. And the officer said, well, you have to come out with me. Rabbi Gumbiner said, well, I'm not going anyplace. I'm staying right here. And the officer said, well, you're definitely coming out. I mean, you can choose whether you would like to be dragged out by your feet or you would prefer to walk out, but you're definitely coming out. At which point Rabbi Gumbiner said, well, I'm not going to come out myself. So I agreed to go out with him, and another person sitting near him agreed to go out with him. And the three of us went out. Rabbi Gumbiner, who, by the way, the name would be familiar to you, to many of you at least, he was in fact a direct descendant of the Magen Avraham, Rabbi Abraham Gumbiner, in the middle of the 1600s, the great author of the Magen Avraham. Direct descendant on the male line. Rabbi Gumbiner was a graduate of Hebrew Union College, had not bothered telling any of us that when he graduated from Hebrew Union College, his first pulpit was as the rabbi of the congregation, the Reformed congregation in Selma, Alabama. Someone had noticed his name in the list of people who had been arrested and informed the leadership of the Jewish community that Rabbi Gumbiner was here, and they asked for an opportunity to meet with him, as a result of which 3 of us met with the leadership of the Jewish community of Selma. And their message to us was very simple. Their message to us was that we need to leave as rapidly as possible and take as many Jews as we can with us. Because they said, while they appreciate our sort of spiritual connection to the idea of freedom for Blacks, what we obviously didn't understand is that we are damaging them in a serious way. The small Jewish community of Selma are primarily businessmen. They are already, they said, severely impacted by the boycott that the Black community is conducting against all white stores. But that in addition to that, they in particular, the Jews, are now losing the business of their Christian neighbors, because their Christian neighbors, having noticed the extent to which there is Jewish involvement in Selma, in participation in voting rights activities and in preparations for the march in Selma, they refuse to have any kind of social relationships with them and refuse to do business with them. And so they said to us, you really have to leave. You don't have the right, you don't have the right to cause us this injury. So I'll spare you most of the details. Our response to them was as follows. It's 1965, we said to them. It's 20 years, only 20 years after the end of the Second World War, after 6 million Jews were killed in Europe. We, the Jewish community, in those intervening years, had been telling the good Christians of all of those European countries that responsibility for the Holocaust lied not only with Hitler and not only with the SS and not only with the Nazi Party, but with all of the good Christians who already beginning in 1933, having had the opportunity to hear and see what Hitler's plans were unwilling to take any risk to their own social or economic conditions in order to try to protect Jews. That when the Pope told Catholic priests in all of those years from 1933 all the way into the middle of the war, that they should not publicly speak on behalf of Jews because it would undermine the condition of Catholics in predominantly Protestant countries in Europe, that all of those good Christians shared in the responsibility for the death of 6 million Jews. So we said to our compatriots, well, what is it exactly that you would like us to tell Christians now? That when Christians are persecuting Jews, then other Christians are to be expected to be willing to sacrifice something of their safety and security in order to protect those who are being persecuted. But if Christians are oppressing other Christians, like Blacks, because they're Blacks, then it's okay for Jews not to protest in order to protect the economic and social well-being of the rest of the Jewish community. Really, we said to them, is that what you want us to say? We can't say that. So we told them, listen, if you feel that you're continuing to live where you are living is untenable, we would do everything that it is possible for us to do to persuade the Jewish community of the rest of the country to provide support for you in any way that you need. Economic support to remain here, economic support to move away from here and settle elsewhere. But the one thing that we cannot do is to stop raising our voices and being present to support those who are being persecuted. To raise our voices to help those who need our help, whose lives have been shortened, whose education is being truncated, whose economic opportunities are being deprived of them, whose social reality is that they are not welcome, that they are being told that they are not valuable as human beings and can't even drink from the same fountains as white people. We can't walk away from that, we told them.
Rabbi Berman.
Yes.
My apologies. I'm being asked to keep an eye on the time. I do want to thank you. I think we have about 5 more minutes, and I really want to thank you for helping to illustrate the very real challenges of living a life of Rabbi Heschel's legacy, both in the halachic tradition and in terms of the Agadah. The stories that you're sharing really make these halachic responsibilities come to life in a way that Rabbi Heschel, of course, really wanted us all to understand. So I'm going to turn it back to you for the last 5 minutes. Thank you.
So let me, it's obvious that what I was prepared to talk about was the foundation in Jewish thought for this idea that we as citizens bear responsibility for the conduct of the society within which we live. Anyone who reads the notes or the outline or the text of Rabbi Heschel's talk in 1963, and that extraordinary blending of verses from the Torah and rabbinic teachings and philosophy and verse, this amalgam of extraordinary insights into this sense of human responsibility for other human beings, can't help but understand that we bear as citizens a responsibility for the well-being of the members of our society, and we bear responsibility for the ways in which our society mistreats people. There's a piece of a third story that I want to tell you, though, which I'd like to end with. And that is, I was arrested once again. It was the second time. That second time, there were about 250 people, 40 clergymen, and the chief of police of Selma called out the 40 clergymen. And he told us that he wants us to understand that there are approximately 35 to 50 young Blacks in our group, most of whom are from Selma. And that if we continue our activities, that not only will he charge us all with breach of this ordinance against demonstrating in white neighborhoods, but that he would also charge all of us with resisting arrest. And that if these young men, Black men, are charged with resisting arrest, that their whole futures in the South would be destroyed. They would never have an opportunity for any advanced education. They would never get jobs. They would become outlaws in their own society. They would have to move totally out of the South in order to lead any decent life. And that would be our fault, because we, unless, he said, we would agree that we would sort of pack up and leave Selma immediately. We thought there was a moral dilemma here, and we sort of sat down and went back out into the large room in which we had been held, and we began to discuss this. And pretty soon, it became clear the following was happening. For the young whites in the room, and even for some of the older Blacks, it seemed reasonable to them that we, the clergy, would have a conversation about what was the moral thing to do and what was the correct thing to do. We would make a decision, and then everyone would act in accordance with our decision. But for the younger Blacks there, it was clear to them that that was not the way it needed to be. And they began to speak up very loudly. They said, we're not slaves anymore. We have a voice. This is our future, our futures that you're talking about. We need to make the decision as to whether we are willing to suffer the consequences of the immediate situation in order to assure that these kinds of demonstrations and rallies will continue. Because otherwise, they'll be able to stop it all in its tracks, because all of you good white people will not want to get us into trouble. And therefore, we need to have a voice in this. In consequence of which, we then spent 3 to 4 hours in open debate, this entire group of 250 people, discussing what was our ethical responsibility in this particular situation. And by the end of that time, a vote was taken and the decision was made not to leave. And we stayed. We stayed. So there's another important piece to this story, which I just want to end with. It was already Shabbat at that time. We were arrested on Friday, early in the day, and we were kept through till Shabbat morning. So I had managed to do whatever right I was required to do, and I did not do what I was forbidden to do. I was able to make Kiddush in words, recitation of the verbal affirmation of the holiness of Shabbat. I didn't have wine. I didn't have challah to fulfill the Rabbanan elements related to that. But I did what I could do. I understood at the same time that I was fulfilling the mitzvot, the Rabbanan of kavod and oneg, of kavod in my showing kavod to other human beings, in oneg in the sense of joy that was produced in this entire group in understanding the significance of what they were doing. And that morning, they told us that they would not book us, that they were going to drive us back in buses, back to the black neighborhood, because it was not safe to walk in the white neighborhood. I told this one young man that I was talking with that I would not board the buses because it was Shabbat and I don't ride on Shabbat. There was no need for me to do that. He argued with me. He said it would be dangerous. I said it would be safe. I knew the neighborhood and the such. In any case, I insisted I was not going to board the buses. Eventually, the buses arrived. They lined up. Unbeknownst to me, as the line was waiting to go down the stairs to board the buses, the police officer told them to go down. The people in the front line said, no, none of us are getting on the buses. We're not getting on the buses because there's a rabbi here and he does not travel on the Sabbath, and we are not going to leave him alone. We are not going to leave him alone. Therefore, we're all going to walk back to Brown's Chapel together, not on the buses. We'll walk with him. There was a huge argument about it amongst the police, and they eventually called the mayor and the police chief, and eventually they allowed that to happen. And 250 people, blacks and whites together, marched through the main street of the white neighborhood of Selma, all the way to Brown's Chapel, and we were not silent. Accompanied on one side by a phalanx of buses, on the other side by a phalanx of police officers. Because what had happened in the course of that night was that a sense of comradeship had developed, a sense of ahava had developed, a sense of mutual responsibility for each other had developed, that often takes weeks and months and years of work, and here it developed over that time. And it showed me the power of love, the power of the alliance that can be made that ultimately protects us all, and is the opposite of the hatred that is being seeded to this day in our society. Hatred against strangers, hatred against blacks, hatred against immigrants, hatred against Jews now as well. And the seeding of that hatred will ultimately lead to violence. It can't but do that. And the only enmity that we have to that hatred is the expansion of love. And that's the great challenge that confronts us. Thank you very much.
Rabbi Berman, thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences and the full breadth and depth of the Torah and what you were thinking and doing while you were there. Thank you.
It is my great honor to share Devar Bracha with our dear friends, teachers, and members, Professor Susannah Heschel and Professor Jim Aronson and their daughters, Gittel and Abigail, on the occasion of the 50th yurtzeit of their dear late father and grandfather, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Harab Avram Yeshua Heschel ben Harab Moshe Mordechai Berezel Rivka Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Chazal teach us that there are at least three ways that we honor our deceased parents and turn their memories into a bracha. One, we mourn their absence. Two, we are Mekadesh Shem Shemaim, we sanctify the divine name in their merit. The recitation of Kaddish represents this. And three, we perpetuate their living legacy. Famously, in 1965, when Rabbi Heschel returned from Selma, he said, "Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying." Along these same lines, the Gemara in Eruvin, Daf Ayin Amud Bet, introduces a halachic concept that holds great metaphoric power. Yoresh Kare Da'avua, a child is the legs of their parent. Professor Susannah and Professor Jim, Gittel and Avi, are the legs of Rabbi and Rebbetzin Heschel. May their words and deeds continue to bring merit to their parents and grandparents and perpetuate Rabbi and Rebbetzin Heschel's living legacy. May their memories be for a blessing.
I'm still a bit on a high, reflecting everything that we just heard from Rabbi Saul Berman, and I want to thank again Rabbi Winberg and Berman for sharing that Torah with us and helping us to understand the halachic, spiritual Torah root of so much of what Rabbi Dr. Heschel was involved in. And there's something which is amazing about understanding that his Torah has continued over the past 50 years, and God continues way beyond those 50 years as we think about the future, which we'll do in our panel later tonight. We have the opportunity now to meet his daughter, to spend time speaking with Professor Joshua Heschel, who is, of course, the chair of the Jewish Studies program and the Eli Black, a distinguished professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Susannah is joining us tonight from her living room, not far from Rabbi Winberg's living room in Newton, Massachusetts. Susannah, you can unmute yourself just while we're preparing to hear from you. And I remember not that living. I've been in your living room there too, but I remember sitting with you, paying a shiva call in your parents' living room soon after your mother Sylvia passed away in 2007. And a number of us YCT students, Rabbi Winberg, perhaps you were there as well, were paying a shiva call, joining together, making a minyan after your mom had passed away. And I was touched. I was touched by the beautiful concert piano that was in the house. And as I walked around the house, I snooped a little bit and noticed that all of the walls were covered with honorary degrees that had been given over the years, up until 1973, of course, to your father, from various institutions around the world. You, when we were planning this, I reached out to you, said, "Can we talk today?" You said to me, "Sorry, I'm in Lublin right now. They're inaugurating a new center." You didn't tell me the Pope was going to be there too. Inaugurating a new center, studying my father's legacy. And so I want to start off tonight and ask you, who was your father to you? And who was your father that he became such a universal figure to so many people? Good evening, Professor Heschel.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Yonah Berman. I think Rabbi Saul Berman. It was a great honor, something that all of us will always treasure, hearing your words tonight. Thank you. I want to also thank Rabbi Avi Weiss, who's been my hero for forever. And I thank you and Rabbi Saul Berman. You organized the Shiva for my mother, and I'm always grateful. And that's why I donated some of my father's library to Chovevei Torah. And Rabbi Linzer, I thank you for all that you've done. I am especially very moved by the words of my rabbi, Rabbi Benjamin Samuels, who's also Rabbi Seth Winberg's rabbi. We both live here in Newton. That was very lovely. Thank you. And also what Martin Luther King III said, that was a big surprise, and it was wonderful. I just have to say that I'm very moved by the gratitude of people who knew my father, especially people in the civil rights movement, because that was in the 1960s. It was 60 years ago. And yet I find that civil rights leaders are still grateful. And that is a lesson for me, for all of us, about the importance of gratitude and the importance of what we do and what a difference it can make. When you ask me about my father, I'll tell you, I feel my father really was a Hasidic Rebbe. Rabbi Belkin once said to him, "You're the rabbi to the world." And in many ways he was, because people from around the world, Jews and non-Jews, came to him and asked him for advice and were inspired by him and his writings. And more than that, he was a Hasidic Rebbe in the way that, I had the great privilege when I was a child still to know some of the great Rebbes who came from Europe to America. My uncle, the Kopitchnitzer, and cousins, the Boyaner, the Novominsker, the Shatner. These were extraordinary human beings, unforgettable, with the kind of gentleness and kindness, the sensitivity of someone who devotes their whole life to praying more deeply, spends their whole life cultivating their inner life. My father was like that. These were Rebbes who were so empathic and kind and wanted to listen in a deep way to whatever the people brought to them, their troubles. My father was like that, but he also had the joy of Hasidism, the celebration, because, my home, when something special happened, he knew how to celebrate. He was happy. He was never withdrawn. He was never moody. He was always very present and full of enthusiasm and excitement. So I say this about him as a person. I think that he also gave us perhaps the awareness that in a way, Hasidism is always latent within Judaism. And there were moments when it began to flourish and something happened, but finally, he said, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, brought heaven down to earth. And he felt that way deeply. I agree with him. There's something so profound in my father's understanding of what it is to be a human being and how possible it is for us to develop as human beings, to sense and realize that God is always with us, everywhere. I just say one last thing.
Go ahead.
There's a little phrase in Tehillim, in the Psalms. It says, "V'ani tefillah." Ani tefillah. And the commentaries say, well, it means I'm praying, or I'm a person of prayer, and so on. As usual, medieval commentaries get a little nervous, but there's something very moving about the idea that you can make your life into a prayer. And I think my father did. His life was a prayer. And I think he's telling us also that that's what it is to be a Jew, to be a religious person, to be a human being. We have that possibility to make our life a prayer. So that's what I think about when I think of my father, but there's so much more. But thank you, Rabbi Berman, for the opportunity.
There is, thank you. There is so much more. Something that I think about when I think about your father, there's a children's book that we have at home, which parallels the stories of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with that of your father. Two individuals, I'm sure you've seen it, two individuals who encounter so much adversity earlier in their lives and who move throughout their lives not prevented, not stopped by what has happened to them until that point in their lives, but they embrace the challenges and they take upon themselves the opportunities to try to make the world a better place. Your father moving from Warsaw to the United States, losing so much of his family before the war, during the war. I wonder what the source of his optimism was? We didn't prepare this question when we talked before.
As an optimism, because, and he always used to say to me, you can't despair. Despair is a sin. Despair suggests that God is not present, and it's just, yeah. So his optimism came from his deep emunah, from his faith, without question. But, and he writes in his book on the prophets, for example, he says, evil is never the climax of history. I think what disturbed my father is not despair. I think he was shocked by indifference. And the reason he was shocked by indifference, in part, is also, it's Hasidic. A Hasidic Rebbe is someone who is always moved. And my father and Dr. King both used the same language in some speeches. They said, the God of the Bible is not the unmoved mover of Aristotle, who, sets things up and then steps back. But rather, the God of the Bible is deeply moved by us and deeply affected by us. My father is talking about Sorach Gavoha, and he calls it in English divine pathos, that God is affected by human actions. And we know this from Kabbalah, of course. We say before we pray, before we make Kiddush, we say, L'shem yichud kuchabrichu shchinte. So my father expanded that. It's something that one of his students, Art Green, wrote about, that we can actually also bring that about, that unity within God, also in the way we treat other human beings, in the mitzvot ben adam l'chavero, and the way we treat other human beings. And so, when you think about what my father said when he returned from Selma, and he said, I felt my legs were praying. That's what he means, l'shem yichud, V'ani tefillah becomes a prayer. And that's also so fundamentally Hasidic. What I do, how I do what I do, even in the most quotidian, mundane things of my life, to act with refinement and with the recognition that God is present in this moment. And I felt that about my father when we would go somewhere, go to the grocery store. Sometimes in New York City, the person at the cash register wasn't very happy, not in a good mood. But my father had such a nice way of talking to people. I think we all have a tendency, if someone is a little unfriendly to us, we respond in an unfriendly way. But my father transformed. He tried to make the person feel better. And that to me is also what a Rebbe does. It's Hasidic, it's Jewish, it's, yeah. That idea, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, that idea that you can also transform things, transform someone's mood, to celebrate, to bring joy to somebody. And he was like that.
Can we speak about that a little bit in the context of Shabbat specifically? When you and I spoke last week, we spoke about recent issues of the New York Times that spoke about issues around Shabbat. We don't necessarily have to go back to that conversation specifically, although if you'd like to give your commentary on that, you're welcome to. But I really wonder, what was the Sabbath like? Not for Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the writer, but Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the father. What was Shabbos like in your house growing up?
Well, so first of all, I will just say that some of what's been written lately about Shabbat, I did see something in the New York Times. People like Shabbat dinner so much that even on Wednesday make. So of course, without a halachic framework, it's not Shabbat. And Shabbat is also about joy. They spoke too often recently about what you have to give up give up your computer, and the phone and so forth. But you're receiving. Shabbat comes to us. And I think that's what's so special. When I was a child, so my mother, of course, would go to the different stores in the neighborhood, and the Upper West Side would go with her. There was a kosher butcher store, and then the greengrocer for the vegetables, and the cake store for the challah, and then start cooking. And my mother would cook, and the house began to have wonderful smells, just like Jerusalem on a Friday afternoon. You walk through the streets and you smell Shabbat coming. And then my father came home early from his office, and he would get ready, and my mother. But what I loved is also just that feeling, the intensity of the day, how it becomes more intense as the day goes on, and suddenly it's time and everything has to stop. And we would kindle the lights in the dining room, and then we would go into the living room where the window faced the Hudson River, and we would watch as the sun set. And I think when we would just sit and talk, the three of us, and that was special. That was extraordinary. I think that we're talking about a gift that comes to us, Shabbat. I feel it's one of the greatest gifts that the world has received, that we've received from the Kadosh Baruch Hu as Jews, and we've given to the world. And I was recently in Lublin, Poland, where there is a wonderful effort going on at the Catholic University of Lublin to foster better attitudes toward Jews and Judaism on every level, not just on the academic level, but everywhere. But in Lublin, there's a magnificent yeshiva building, but there was no Shabbat. There are no Jews. And I'd never experienced, I'd never been in such a place. And it was startling. And I just feel that the hope for the world in so many ways rests on Shabbat. We need Shabbat, and I'm sorry that Christians gave it up. It is a terrible loss. And I'm sorry for Jews who don't understand the joy. And in my home, Shabbat was full of joy and laughter and stories, and a wonderful spirit, a wonderful atmosphere.
You mentioned Christianity. Your father had a special relationship. Of course, Dr. King was a minister, but his relationship with Christianity, with Christian clergy, goes beyond just that one very unique relationship. Can you speak a little more to that aspect of his work, of his rabbinate?
Yes. So actually, when my father was a student at the University of Berlin, which he entered in 1927, he wrote a doctoral dissertation about the prophets. And much of the dissertation is a very sharp critique of Protestant biblical scholarship and the failure to understand the Bible. He felt also that there were some Jews who also, the kind of critical attitude, couldn't appreciate the poetry, the inspiration. But after the war, my father didn't write anything like that again. Instead, he was grateful for the Christians who were helpful to him and understood his work and encouraged him, because a lot of people didn't in those days when he was writing The Sabbath. There were Jews who attacked that book, and it was painful for my father. He worried sometimes that maybe he was doing something wrong, because, we all need affirmation. But yes, he had friends who were Christian theologians, and my father's hope at that point was trying to make Christians appreciate the holiness of Judaism. That's what was important. And yes, there were some who said, that he shouldn't go to see the Pope in Rome. And my father said, if it will help to save one life, I will go. And yes, he had a wonderful friendship with Dr. King. But let me just say something else that I really would like to tell you. At the seminary in those days, the davening was an Orthodox synagogue, similar to my synagogue today, Shari Tefillah in Newton. And no one at the seminary would go to a conservative synagogue, even though they were teaching men, only men then, to become conservative rabbis. But it was also a service that was very, how shall I describe it? It was a little bit cold. It was not a place where they would ever end Shabbat morning davening with Shir Kavod, for example. So my father would like to go to the Ger Shtibel on the Upper West Side. That was where he went when he really wanted to daven. And I went with him too sometimes, my mother. And I just want you to know that after my father died, Rabbi Tziviak would come to our home on Friday afternoon every week for years and bring us challah and a bottle of wine for Shabbos. And I have to say, to me, it was like one of the stories about the Baal Shem Tov coming to the home of a widow. It was extraordinary and deeply moving to me. And I just say that because it's those kinds of gestures that mean so much and tell us so much about the soul of Judaism.
Not just the soul of Judaism, but also that sense of reflection back that your father provided so much chesed, so much goodness to other people. And as you just pointed out, someone was able to bring that some of back to your home, to your family in the time of sorrow, and to bring that sense of love back into your home. We have a few minutes left. I would like to do something that we had not fully planned. Rabbi Saul Berman, if you could just wave and tell me that you're okay with me bringing you into the conversation for a minute. Thank you. I'm asking you to unmute if you can, please. And I'm going to ask the two of you if you have anything to share with each other, any brachot. You know, we're going to move in the next portion to thinking about younger clergy and thinking about how they bring Rabbi Dr. Heschel's legacy to their students today. What is the Torah that matters today? What's the Torah that we want to bring to our students over the next 50 years? And I'll ask either of you, both of you, to comment if you'd like.
Well, I mean, one of the, I remember the first book of Dr. Heschel's that I read. I read when I was still in high school. I accidentally never heard of him, but I picked it up in the library, in a local library, and I brought it home. And on Shabbat afternoon, I lie down with the book, and I became entranced with it. I just sort of was there. It was a long Shabbat afternoon. I spent hours just reading it, and sort of felt as if I was going into a different sort of layer of reality. And so, you know, that sensibility related to him, that there's a kind of spiritual power that his words have to actually transform the reality, has infused some of my own thinking about sort of the difference between spirituality and holiness. Because I believe that when we use the term spiritual, what we're really talking about is a state of awareness, whether it's the awareness of the presence of God or the awareness of God's values, or the awareness of transcendence. I mean, what we call spiritual is that. Holiness goes beyond that. Holy spirituality is just a preparatory step to holiness. Holiness is the ability to actually bring God's values, God's virtues to life in the real world. And I think that's what Rabbi Heschel had the capacity to do. He wasn't only a master of words, he was the master of actions that had the capacity to transform the world in consonance with the very values and vision that he saw, that he experienced, that he lived, that he felt in his awareness of the presence of God in his life.
Susannah, anything to add?
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Berman. That was wonderful. One of the last books that my father worked on is actually, there were two books, one in English, one in Yiddish. He wrote a book about the Kotzker Rebbe and the importance of authenticity, that sometimes people would call my father, strangers would call on the phone and say, what should I do? I'm a Jew, but I don't know how to be observant. And he would tell them, start with Shabbat, kindle the lights. But he never imposed. He never said, you must do, this is what you must do, or, and in a way it stemmed from this, from the Kotzker. He quoted the Kotzker, your Judaism has to be authentic to who you are. You can't, Kotzker said, you can't be Jewish the way somebody else is Jewish. It's like wearing somebody else's pair of shoes. You have to know who you are. And my father did. He knew who he was. And he was, as a result, very understanding of other people. He was tremendously empathic. He was someone that I think everybody felt they could talk to in a deep way, and that he would listen in a deep way. That's what I mean about that. I see him as a Hasidic Rebbe in that sense too. But he had tremendous respect for individuals, for the individual. He did write an essay, it's in the collection called The Insecurity of Freedom, about the individual Jew, and how rabbis have sometimes neglected the individual, that we talk so much about the collective. I think people, everybody needs a Rebbe. Everybody needs someone to talk to, someone who will listen with empathy. I think if you ask about training rabbis, I would urge that especially. And that's really what I miss so much. And my father said it also, by the way. He used to say how much he missed his father and how much he wished he could talk to his father again. And I miss my father very much. Also, just to talk about so many things. He had so much wisdom, and he spoke always with his heart. And you know what I mean, from the heart goes into the heart.
Any other thoughts, final reflections before we move on to the next part of our program tonight?
So I find it wonderful that people are inspired by my father. I think it's great when people study his work and sometimes want to compare his writings to other people's writings or contextualize some of his writing in an academic way. That's fine. That's great. But that he brings inspiration to people, that's extraordinary. I'm grateful. I think he makes us be better Jews, better human beings, better Christians, whatever our faith is, he deepens it. He has a way of being able to make us realize also the joy of life, And I appreciate that too, because as Rabbi Berman said earlier, there's a lot of anger in our world today, a lot of resentment, and we fear it may lead to violence. And so I hope that my father's legacy is one that can soften hardened hearts, that can make us turn away from anger into joy, and that can make us realize how much the Bible has to offer us, as my father said, a psalm every day. Maybe we can have a psalm every day. So I thank you so much for this evening and for including me and for all that everyone has said tonight. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Berman again, and thank you, Professor Susannah Heschel again. In conclusion, I'll say that before we move on to the next part of our program, I'll share that I watched last night a number of videos on YouTube, Professor Heschel, of your father, and also was finally able to find one of your mother. And I'm thinking a lot about my mother as we, again, mark her yahrzeit soon as well. And it's actually a video that she helped conclude the program 25 years ago. The Jewish Theological Seminary had a program marking your father's 25th yahrzeit. They also had a program, by the way, marking his 50th yahrzeit a few nights ago. And we're grateful for the fact that there are many different groups that are marking his yahrzeit, that are remembering him and thinking about his legacy and how to continue that work. And your mother said something, I'm going to try to get it right now, but she basically said how much your father appreciated when people got him, when people understood something about his Torah. And, you know, we talked a little bit about how he was a Hasidic Rebbe, and he was someone who really exemplified those qualities of being a Rebbe, something that I know that Rabbi Winberg and I both appreciate about Rabbi Berman, whom you were just speaking as well, Rabbi Berman Sr., as we call him in this context. And I'm thinking about the feeling of the fact that all of us have this need, this desire to get your father, to understand something, to feel connected to him. And while so many of us have not had the opportunity to meet him, we were not alive when he was alive, the reality is that for many of us, he's a Rebbe. And I want to thank you for channeling that Rebbe and for being a Rebbe for us as well, Susannah, in so many ways. So with that, we're going to close this portion of our program. We're going to have a brief video right now, and then move on to our panel with a couple of program announcements that are going to go in after this video right now.
In Man is Not Alone, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel writes the following: "We go out to meet the world not only by way of expediency, but also by way of wonder. In the first, we accumulate information in order to dominate. In the second, we deepen our appreciation in order to respond." This passage has been enormously important to me and moves me, I have to say, in some very deep and visceral way, because I think what Heschel is basically saying is that there are two ways of living in and responding to the world. There's the way of wonder, of transcending the self, and the way of expediency, which is all about self-assertion. One way of thinking about that is that wonder is the realization that none of this had to be, that the world is a gift, that my life is not something that I earned. And wonder comes with the question, what can I do? I am indebted and grateful. How can I respond to God, to others? What is asked of me? That's probably the sentence Heschel says more than any other in his writing. Something is asked of us. Expediency, in contrast, is about entitlement. It's about everything is mine and I only want more. The Israeli version of that is magia li. It's mine. Rather than giving, I want to take. I want to make things my own. And Heschel really thinks that a lot of the time we face a stark choice. Do we want our lives guided by how can I take or how can I respond? That question guides me all the time, and I aspire to, at least at moments, live up to being guided and animated by that really sacred question of how can I respond?
One of the things that was important for us at YCT in thinking about tonight's program was to make sure, A, that we did not just remember, but that we were able to apply lessons of the life and the Torah of Rabbi Dr. Heschel, and to think about how he has impacted the Orthodox community specifically, a community that we're part of and that many of our musmachim, of our alumni, serve in various capacities. And so we wanted to bring together a group of younger Orthodox clergy who are thinking about Rabbi Dr. Heschel's Torah and who are bringing his Torah to their people in various contexts and various fora. We have a panel. It was pre-recorded due to the time difference between here and Israel, where one of our panelists resides and is hopefully sleeping right now at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, whatever time it is right now in Israel. Our 3 panelists who you're going to hear from right now are Rabbanit Yafit Clymer, who is a member of the faculty of Matan, member of the steering committee of Beit Hillel, and of course, one of the directors of YCT's Ritma program for Israeli rabbis, now in its 4th cohort, bringing together rabbis, Rabbaniot, together first in Israel, where they think about the Rabbanit and what it means to them and their communities, and they can bring themselves to the Jewish community in greater and greater ways. We bring them to the United States as part of that year that they're part of this cohort, and then they continue to do that work in an alumni program that we've been developing. They meet with wonderful people here at YCT. They meet with Rabbi Saul Berman, among many other wonderful people. Rabbi Yafit is joined on this panel by Rabbi Ari Hart, a treasured musmach, alumnus of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. He is the rabbi of Skokie Valley Agudath Jacob in Skokie in Chicago, Illinois, and one of the founders of Uri L'Tzedek and the founder of Solu, an organization working to bring Jews and African Americans together across the often divided landscape of Chicago. Finally, the third panelist is Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein, the rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor to the Jewish Federations of North America, a friend and someone who's really thought about a lot of these issues deeply, as we'll hear in this next segment. Thank you to each of you for being with us this afternoon, pre-recording for our panel and for our discussion that's going to take place a few days from now as we get to view this in the near future. And thinking about the future is an interesting way for us to start, actually, because each of you is a teacher of Torah. Each of you is a rabbi, a member of the clergy, bringing Torah to the world around you in unique ways, whether you are in Chicago, New York, Eretz Yisrael. And the sense, of course, is that none of us was really exposed to Rabbi Heschel during his lifetime. We are younger individuals on this panel, but each of us, I think, feels impacted by his work, by his Torah. And so I want to invite you, please, to share with us as an opening question. How do you feel impacted by his work? What most inspires you and what most inspires your students as you teach his Torah, as you work, as you live his Torah every day? In your lives? And maybe we'll start off with Rabbi Isaiah right here in New York City.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Also, Rabbanit Yafit, Rabbi Ari. I hope we get to spend more time together in the year ahead. So my name is Isaiah. I'm originally from Monsey, New York. And I would say when celebrating the last 50 years, the legacy of Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel, as a kid growing up in Monsey, I did not know about Rabbi Heschel. Being raised in the Haredi community, I wasn't aware of him. It was my Shana Aleph in Israel. I was at Lev HaTorah and I discovered the Sabbath on the bookshelf. And as a musician, as someone who also appreciates lyrics, it was the first time I ever really saw content at that point, Torah content that had just so much poetry and music in a certain way connected to it. And also as someone who was sort of going through my own transformation after being raised in Monsey, New York, and really trying to identify my own connection to Judaism, I felt really connected to that book. There was one other book that was called The Spirit of Tzvat. It was another book in English. And I'll tell you, there were a few rabbis who gave me shade on both of those books. On the Tzvat book, they're like, don't you get to Kabbalah when you're 40, start learning Mishnah, and then with the Heschel book, there were a few comments about how, maybe he wasn't fully aligned with the Das Torah or rabbinic authority of Orthodoxy. So therefore, maybe I shouldn't be reading that book. So anyway, that was my first exposure there. And then I remember I was staffing a birthright trip like a year or two later when I was at Binghamton University, and it was right around MLK Day, and I was trying to source somebody, a rabbi speaking out against racism, and I don't think I was connecting that to Heschel. I would say as a Black Jew with white skin, as someone who was born and raised in an interracial, God-loving Chabad family in Monsey, New York, you know, I knew about Jews who spoke out against racism because in our community we experienced racism. But when Googling on the trip, you know, rabbis who spoke out against racism, I found a quote from Heschel that he said to President Kennedy about needing to stand up against racism, and that every congregation in the country is complicit if we don't pray out, if we don't take action together. I remember reading that on a birthright trip. Sorry, that's just by way of intro about myself a little bit, and also that's my initial exposure. And the last thing I'll share is the work I do today. You know, I work at Jewish Federations of North America as rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor. And Jewish Federations were a movement, were a network of 146 federations, 200 plus community networks that are lay-led around North America, 125 community relations councils. And we've been around for about 100 years. And just 2.5 years ago, did we create a department that's directly focused on justice and equity issues, both in Jewish communal life and in broader society, how we build belonging strategies for all Jews and our loved ones, and also how we show up as authentic allies in broader society to sustain democracy, both in America, in Israel, and around the world. That's really a part of our work. So the work I do each day very much is connected deeply to the legacy of Rabbi Heschel.
Thank you. And finding those personal connections is so powerful. I want to move over to Eretz Yisrael for a moment, to Medinat Yisrael, to the city of Modi'in. Rabbanit Yafit, perhaps you can describe to us a little bit about your connection, which I think probably comes from a different direction and a different angle, as in a new place, a new venue, a new environment in Eretz Yisrael as well.
Thank you. It's really good to be here, and for such a important occasion of remembering Heschel after 50 years since his passing. The first time I was introduced to Rav Heschel was actually about 25 years ago when I first entered the Beit Midrash of Matan in Jerusalem, and we had a very outcast teacher, if I can say that. He came from the Haredi community and he became a Kuknik, Rav Kuk. He learned in Merkaz, and he had a class about Torah Min HaShamayim of Heschel. And we didn't have a building then in Matan. It took a few years to build the beautiful building in Yerushalayim that we have today. And we learned in a shul. And one day he said, you know, I am teaching Rav Heschel in a shul because I think he is kosher and nobody can tell me that I can't talk about Rav Heschel in a shul. And us Israeli young women, we had no idea what he was talking about. Like, why is it such a revolution to speak about Heschel in a shul? It was curious enough for me to go and to look and to check about Heschel more, and since there was very little then in Hebrew, and everything was in English, and I was reading, and also I got to see his picture, and just to see the picture of Heschel with a big beard and the hair, he looked so different. He looked so unrabbinical. Which just more, it sparked me to check more. And as I myself started to teach, I've been lecturing and teaching in Matan for the last 20 years in the different branches of Matan. And I just, the words of Heschel came, like cold water to a tired soul. And for the last 10 years specifically, I've been giving a course in tefillah, more not understanding the words of the Siddur, but understanding the phenomena davening, of prayer, and I go through different thinkers in Jewish history, and Rav Heschel is one of them, and it's always, such a pleasure to see, the look at the eyes of the learners, of the students who for the first time listened to the words, learned the words of Heschel, specifically about tefillah. But before I get to tefillah, I wanna, you asked, what inspired us, what are we taking in our personal life and in our professional life? And I think that the thing that struck me the most, the first time I got to learn his Torah, was his statement about God, that we need to bring God into our lives. And growing up in Israel and, being in a Beit Midrash that very much is influenced by Brisk and Rambam and Rav Soloveitchik, and even Rav Kook, but in a way that the Rambam is saying, after the Rambam decided, that God is transcendental and is far away from us, and this is how we accepted that as a theological fact. And comes Heschel and he says, no, that's a mistake. We have to bring God closer to us. So just the idea that there's someone, daring to stand in front of the Rambam, metaphorically, and say, it's wrong, keeping God so far away from us. We're missing something about religious life. And that idea, the idea that, we need to bring holiness, kedusha, into life. And the idea that not only we need God, but God needs us, and it depends on us, that we can meet God if we'll show God that we want to meet him, and then he'll be available to us. And the idea that, the midrash that says that every day there's a bat kol, there's an echo, a divine echo, searching for people for us to turn to God. And Heschel is saying, Shema Yisrael is that, we should listen, we should hear the voice of God looking for us, asking us to talk to him, and then we can even relive Ma'amad Har Sinai. And all of these ideas are coming, I think, together in his unbelievable Torah, philosophy or theology or existential ideas about tefillah. That through tefillah, through davening, through prayer, we can bring God into the world. And it always amazes me how he speaks about tefillah, and he says, you can't live without tefillah. Like, living without tefillah is living without God. It's living without a soul. Like, you have to daven. It's just a must. Every person must daven. And then he says that if we don't think about God, if we don't think about Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono Shel Olam, then we can't daven. How can we daven if we can't think about God? And then he brings this unbelievable concept of learning the art of praying. So we have a book already by a Jew, Learning the Art of Love, but Heschel is saying we have to learn the art of praying and feeling the presence of God. And he didn't even, the few lectures that he gave in front of the consulate of JTS, it was 53, if I remember correctly. And he says, he says, look at how we daven, look at our shuls, look at what's happening. He's talking about America, the same thing in Israel, by the way. And something is going wrong, and we have to rethink about how we teach tefillah, how we daven, how we turn to prayer and davening ourselves. And he started, speaking about the dialogical element of man and God, and to turn to God, and to Rabbi Zeh was mentioning the singing and the music. And Rav Heschel is saying, praying is singing. It's a chant. It's like a person cannot live without a song. That's how we cannot live without a prayer. And that idea of everything that he elaborates and bring it into such a depth of in regards to tefillah, to davening, to praying, not only through the siddur and in shul, but as an everyday act that brings us closer to God, that connects us to what's behind, to the mystery, to those moments, where when we don't understand something and then we do understand something and understand that that's where God is, and we have the ability, but the amazing, like one of the most stunning phrase of Heschel is the radical amazement, that we need to live in God's world with radical amazement, and then that can uplift our entire life.
Thank you. So interesting to see how you both alluded to similar concepts, but each found them in your own way. Rabbi Zaya in certain ways focusing on Torah, on his experience of Heschel through early Talmud Torah experiences, studying Torah. Rabbanit Yafit, you moving into a space of avodah, of prayer, even in the context of your learning and your teaching. And Rav Ari, I'm going to ask you to sort of take us home a little bit, thinking about Ma'asim Tovim, the service that you do in your work as both a community rabbi and as a founder of an organization, Solu, which is really following so many of Rabbi Heschel's teachings as a legacy of work in the Chicago community.
Sure, thank you. It's very inspiring to be in this conversation, and those words about tefillah, it's good musar, Rabbanit Yafit, good musar for all of us, very much including myself, about what it really means to pray. My own journey to Heschel started in my early 20s when I was in a period of hashkafic searching, and I was just reading everything I could. And someone, recommended, I think probably the Sabbath was the first piece. And then other essays, other machshava, other, his ideas about the Nevi'im and his ideas about the Gemara and different oral traditions. And I really just remember soaking it in and being like, this is an interesting guy. I don't know if I agree with everything. I don't know what I think about all this stuff. It's different. It's radical. It's poetic. It's beautiful. Just reading a lot. And it wasn't until I think I was at Chovevei when I learned that Rabbi Heschel was incredibly involved in the civil rights movement and marched in Selma and did all these amazing things. Like, I just had no idea. I just thought he was kind of a really cool thinker, Jewish thinker. And he is a really cool Jewish thinker. And and what was so powerful about making that connection for me was that those were two sides of the same coin, that the amazing work he did in civil rights emerged from his Torah. I mean, there was his Torah, and it wasn't a separation between the two. And for me, that was very important because I, always had a strong, I felt the prophetic Jewish call to justice and Derech Hashem, the way of God, Lasot Tzedakah Mishpat, to do righteousness and justice. That really resonated with me, but I kind of thought that was external to my hashkafic, halachic life. There's like the Torah learning and the base medrash, and then there's, things that happen out in the world. And so what was so important for me about really learning about Heschel and what he did and what he stood for and what he accomplished was the integration of the two, that the Torah, the tefillah, the chesed, the tzedek was all part of the same amazing package, and they all informed each other. And that gave me a lot of just a new perspective on what it could mean to be a God-fearing, halacha-following, justice-advocating Jew. And it gave me a model, to try to try to follow in the paths that he blazed. Me and many, many, many other people have tried to walk in those giant footsteps. And, thank God he blazed that path, because I think he really created space for so many people to do that kind of work. So for me, what it means is to be present in some of the great, moral issues of our day, poverty, injustice, racism, all the things that he was involved in his time, being involved in those now and trying to do it as a Torah Jew, not just because, as a universalist, but as a deep particularist. You know, Heschel owned and beautifully represented his own particular identity and perspectives while in conversation and in action with these big universal issues. And that's a really, really beautiful model that we strive to follow when we go show up on the south side of Chicago and go show up with the Rohingya Muslim community and talk about genocide and talk about systemic, racism in Chicago over the decades, and try to be involved with those issues as Orthodox Jews, as Torah Jews, as Hasidic Jews, Hasidic inspired Jews, which he was, and which, many of us are. So that for me is what was so important about Heschel.
Thinking about how we, if speak for myself as a member of an Orthodox community, an Orthodox rabbi, someone who spends his time thinking about these issues in many ways, we often feel as though circling the wagons means separating ourselves, and perhaps especially the points of strength that we find ourselves in as Jews in America, as Orthodox Jews in America, and as Jews and as Orthodox Jews, of course, with Medinat Israel, something we're so proud of being able to celebrate coming up on 75 years, is that opportunity that we have to project that strength in a way which is embracing of the needs of others and bringing a sense of social justice, of that prophecy beyond ourselves, in a way that Rabbi Ari, in his hopeful message, has said that we've already started to do. And I think that each of us in our own way today has said, each of you has said, is something which you feel that sense of hope, you see that happening around you. And I want to ask you, in just the few minutes that we have left, could you perhaps ask a question of each other, something that you've heard that you want to hear more about? This is a chance to be able to do that right now.
Well, it's actually a question for both distinguished members here, Rabbanim here. Regarding what I said about his tochecha, about the way that we act in shul, like the way that the fact that the Jews are not taking their davening seriously. I mean, do you find in your own shuls that you can bring that spirit of God? God exists in your shuls, and how do you do that? How do you bring the connection to your communities?
Whether your shuls are specific,
whatever community
locations or
the
entirety of North America.
Sometimes, and in some parts of it. I think in the Orthodox world, we can get to aspects of feeling connected and feeling inspired and feeling uplifted, and those are connected to aspects of the divine. I think there's another side, which would actually be terrifying, if we really brought it into shul, and that's the other side of the Navi, of the prophetic call, which is like, you guys are terrible, you're failing. You're failing spiritually, you're failing ethically, and you're going to be held accountable. And that's also the divine. And that's also something that Heschel was willing to bring. And that's something that we are not so comfortable bringing in. And I wonder how we might, because it's an important message. I'm all about the hope. Hope is great. It's really important. I have a lot of hope. And there's a lot of great things happening, and there's also a lot of really not great things happening in our souls, our communities, in the world. And I feel like maybe we need to get a little more comfortable with that other side of Heschel, which is very challenging, but maybe we need to hear it.
Truth. I'm thinking also about the fact that when it comes to tefillah, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shlomi, who's known to be the founder of the renewal movement. Like, I was even curious as you were sharing if he had ever spoken with Rabbi Heschel and if at all. And I know that, through working at Isabel Friedman Jewish Retreat Center and learning about the legacy of Reb Zalman, that he never intended on renewal Judaism to be its own denomination. He really wanted a renewal of tefillah across the Jewish world. If you look at the Pew study, about 12 to 15% of American Jews go to synagogue on a weekly to twice a month basis. From that 12%, about 51%, so half of the people who go, say they feel little to no sense of belonging. So depending on where we go in Orthodoxy, there's sometimes a social pressure, as someone who leads services a lot, as a chazan, I sometimes, if I'm at a shul that I don't know well, I'm sometimes I feel that social pressure not to add that extra song in, so to speak. And connecting on the themes of like the prophetic versus the priestly, versus the majestic, like these different archetypes of power. It's a bracha sometimes to be a mamlechet kohanim when your whole community is priests, but that means you have to start davening exactly when you start davening, end davening exactly when you end davening, every Dvar Torah exactly specific. And sometimes it could be when you're a priest, sometimes there's those gedarim or those boundaries sometimes make things feel a little bit more transactional. And when you're a prophet and you're calling out and it's a motive, sometimes that hybrid, again, going just back to that theme that I think has come up with each of us differently, of just fusion. And I think that in terms of like a spiritual evolution or spiritual revolution within synagogue life, I think there's one that is in the making. There's already many institutions across the Jewish community that have been really trying to reimagine what synagogue life can look like and how we fuse, again, both that traditionalist lens and the priestly, the structures, but then also create different models so that people could have their own spiritual expressions intact as well.
Our time is short, and I want to ask us if anyone has any final words, final thoughts, maybe just 30 seconds. Gratitude to Rav Heschel, to what he represents, continues to represent in this world 50 years after his passing. Any final thoughts from our panel today?
First of all, I have a prayer. I have a tefillah that will be able to take his words and act on them, because when the great people are not here anymore, and we have so much of their thinking in Torah, it's up to us to decide to take it and to do more with it. And I'm definitely with a deep gratitude towards Heschel's Torah, towards Rabbi Heschel's Torah, and that keep teaching me and keep reminding me that that to be in the world of God, we need to be in awe, and look around us and just to be in awe. He says that awe precedes faith. And I think of it as like a little kid, everything amazes him and amazing the child, and we lost that. And just to be able to try a little bit of that every day or every week, or every so often, just to stand and look around and be amazed with people and with nature and with thoughts and with our families and students. And to be in awe, to be in that radical amazement.
One lesson that I learned from Dr. Susannah Heschel, Rabbi Heschel's daughter, was to never underestimate the power of inspiration, and the role that inspiration and inspiring people can do, not just for them as individuals, but for a full generation. And although the picture of Heschel and King I sometimes struggle with, because it seems as like a check the box, okay, we're in it together, we did it, sitting on the laurels of the 20th century civil rights era versus thinking about the 21st century civil rights era, which is not the same thing. So sometimes I do struggle with the picture, but I also, that picture has inspired generations of people to think about what each of our role can be. So I think one thing that I'll just bring, and gratitude also to Dr. Susannah Heschel for really embodying the leadership and adding to the light of her father, to not underestimate the power of bringing people together and to really bring that inspiring light, because we need it so deeply in our generation.
Amen to what both of you said. And I'll conclude my remark here with quoting my pastor friend, Pastor Chris Harris, who I've done a lot of work with in Chicago, and he always talks about that picture, and it is an amazing picture, and it inspired me. And what he says is, we need to keep the frame, but we need new pictures in the frame. So the frame stays the same, but we got to put some new pictures, and we can't just rely on the old pictures. So let's go out and make some pictures. Let's go and inspire people and tell new stories that build on the past, but that speak to the next generation, that continually add to that amazing legacy and build on it, and not just rely on what he did, but to keep moving it forward. And I have to believe that's exactly what he would want.
Thinking about that picture, and the need for new pictures in there, but thinking about that picture right now within that frame, it's a march, right? They were marching, they were moving, they were on their way somewhere. Avraham Avinu is someone who was a traveler. He moved around the world in order to find God, to bring God to the world, to bring God where God was most needed in the world. Listening to your stories today, I'm inspired by the way that the three of you move around the world to bring Torah to where it is needed, whether in the United States, in Israel, and really making sure that another generation of Jewish people will hear the messages that need to be heard of God and of this prophetic voice, which is channeling such an important part of what God is about and needs to be about for this generation, for the next generation, for the next 50 years to come. So I want to thank each of you for your time today, and I look forward to continuing our conversation in the future. Thank you, Shalom, and Kol Tuv.
Thank you, Rav Yonah.
Thank you. Shkoyach.
So much. Shkoyach. Thank you.
We have one segment left. So if you can stay on a little longer, please do so. And as I mentioned, we are over time. So if you do feel like logging off at this time, we will be sharing the following segment as the rest of the program will be shared, recordings in the very near future. I just want to thank everyone, first of all, for their patience figuring out our tech issues at the beginning of the night. I'm glad that they were resolved, and I'm glad that so many people joined us, both here as well as on Facebook Live. And I know that more people will be watching the recording in the near future. The recordings also will include some longer director's cuts, if you will. I feel like this is becoming YCT Netflix a little bit, but there really are some outtakes that were pieces that we could not have as part of tonight's program that were really wonderful. More conversation that took place. And so there's another question that I asked Mr. Martin Luther King III that we could not include just because of time, for example. So please do watch out for those in your email. I'll also ask you to stay tuned for an upcoming program that YCT is going to be having in March. On March 26th, we're going to be having a second Seder Sense. We had one a year or two ago, I believe now, and it was wonderful. A way to think about Pesach, preparing for the Seder, preparing to bring the Seder, and the liberation and redemption that we spoke so much about tonight, and that ongoing need to continue to refresh and renew ourselves spiritually before the Seder, an opportunity to come together and to learn with some of our greatest teachers, our greatest alumni. That'll be coming up in the near future. I want to take an opportunity before we come back and watch some final tribute videos. I want to thank a number of different individuals, of course, Professor Susannah Heschel, Rabbi Saul Berman, and Rabbi Seth Winberg for their Torah tonight. I want to thank a number of people in the YCT office for their ongoing support of these efforts, including tonight, people who are monitoring our Zoom and helping people in and sometimes out of the room as necessary. I want to thank Eva for her ongoing help, Eva Mandel. I want to thank Jackie Lebhol for her work in terms of setting up all of the background work for our work tonight. Noya Lavi, Ruthie Simon, of course, Rabbi Dov Linzer, for being a thought partner in a lot of this and pushing us to think about how to make this program the best program it could be for all of our many communities. Special thank you to Corvin, to Rivka, and to Paula for being our closed caption and ASL interpreters tonight. And a thank you to our many other speakers, some of whom you've heard already. And just to give you coming attractions right now, we're going to hear now from Rabbi Sara Hurwitz, from Rabbi Yissaschar Katz, from Rabbi Todd Berman, from Professor Dror Bondi, from Rabbi Dr. Shmuly Yanklowitz, and we'll conclude the night with a special address from Rabbi Yitz Greenberg over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. Again, these will be shared with you in the near future, so I understand if it's late for you. If you're on the West Coast, you should certainly stick around a little longer. And finally, a thank you again to our partner institutions and to all of you for being partners in the work of Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel, for marching, for doing all that we do to bring his Torah to a world that continues to need it 50 years later, as we wish to bring that Torah to the world for 50 more years and beyond. I'll again dedicate our learning tonight to the memory of my Ima, to legacy of Bani Lax Berman, Bela Rachel Bar Chaim, B'Leah Shendel. And we'll continue now with our short tribute videos.
Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel was a rare leader in that he had a philosophy on everything. He was a teacher, a role model, but a thinker about not only halakha and a Jewish community, but on life writ large. And one quote that I find so inspiring, I think speaks to the way he saw the world and a way that I aspire to see the world. He says, our goal should be to live life in radical amazement. I love that phrase, radical amazement. He says, get up in the morning and look up at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted. Everything is phenomenal. Everything is incredible. Never treat life casually. To be spiritual is to be amazed. What an amazing way to live one's life, to aspire to wake up and look at the world around us and see beauty, to find joy in a world that's so dark and where life could be so difficult. We need to sometimes look beyond that and find radical amazement in the everyday. When Heschel talks about radical amazement, I think it's a philosophy of seeing what is not obvious in front of you, to be able to look into the world and dream and see beyond. And I think that's how Maharat was able to come into being. I could not imagine being an Orthodox female rabbi, but somehow knowing that the world cannot exist without Orthodox female wisdom contributing to the world allowed me to put one foot in front of the other and start Maharat. And I think this notion of radical amazement is what I hope to impart to my students, our alumni, because they should keep building the world and keep making the world as reach its full potential, that they should reach their full potential, and that they can do it if they can see beyond what is right before their eyes and see a world through a lens of what could be potential of radical amazement.
Picking one text that resonates from Rabbi Dr. Heschel is a hard task. Rabbi Heschel has been so prolific and has spoken and written so much. But if I had to, I would pick his biography of Kotsk as one of the texts of Rabbi Dr. Heschel that speaks to me most, because as we all know, the old adage, every biography is really autobiography. And when Rabbi Dr. Heschel emphasizes what he sees about Kotsk, beneath the surface, one can see also what Rabbi Heschel himself was about. And there one gets a sense of how much Hasidus was pulsating throughout his veins and throughout his passion, because his encounter with the world, his encounter with the secular world, with the modern world, was deeply informed by Hasidut. And that deeply resonates for me because for many of us in the modern Orthodox world, we're first and foremost Orthodox, and modernity is there as a means to infuse and to enrich our Orthodoxy. Given my own Hasidic upbringing, I actually kind of see them slightly different in the sense that modernity is not merely a means. Modernity is an end of itself. As a Chassid, I believe that there is a Chalak Elokai Mimal in everybody and in everything, and therefore I see Kedusha in every man, every woman, Jew, non-Jew, and the same is with cultural opportunities out there in the world. One can find Kedusha in a play, in a musical, in a movie, in a dance, in a novel, and so on and so forth. And even more so, part of my drive to create a optimally inclusive orthodoxy within the boundaries of halacha is informed by that very same passion and that same belief that there is kedusha in everybody, every man, every woman, every Jew, every non-Jew, regardless of their gender or orientation. And therefore, I've dedicated myself to bringing in within the Orthodox and halachic field as many people as possible because of that belief that there is a chalak alakay mimal in everybody. And my greatest inspiration is Rabbi Dr. Heschel. It is no doubt to me that when we look at Dr. Heschel's life and we see him being someone who doesn't necessarily act like a conventional Hasid. He marches to Salem. He marches with Martin Luther King. And there's no doubt that for him, that was greatly influenced by his Hasidic heritage that believed that there's Kedusha in everybody and that regardless of race, gender, and orientation, there's something Kedusha and something holy. And in fact, he said so much in his famous quote where he said, for many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Right? He combines the two. It's protest, but it's also something sacred and something transcendental. Legs are not lips and walking is not kneeling. And yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying. And my hope is now that we are reflecting on the legacy of Rabbi Avram Yeshua Heschel is that more of us within the observant and the Orthodox community will be exposed to that Torah, because really that Torah is a incredibly important Torah that would help enrich our avodas Hashem, particularly for those of us who operate in this kind of dual world of orthodoxy and modernity. Zecher Tzadik Livracha.
Okay, I want to read a quote which really motivated this article I recently wrote on the nature of thinking. And it's something that Heschel said that really spoke to me. This is from a lecture he gave on theology to Solomon Schechter teachers in 1956. I'm skipping a little piece here and there. We were essentially trained in a non-Jewish world. We're inclined to think in non-Jewish terms. I'm not discouraging exposure to the non-Jewish world. I'm merely indicating that it is not biblical thinking, is not rabbinic thinking, is not Hasidic thinking, it is non-Jewish thinking. We would also like to have in our thinking a Jewish view of things. I say to you personally that this has been my major challenge, that is, how to think in a Jewish way of thinking. This was the major concern and the major thesis of my dissertation, The Prophets. Since that day, I consider this to be my major effort. It is not an easy enterprise. I found that really profound in my life because I guess I left Heschel. I grew up and in college, I think Heschel was a very important voice for me. But as I kind of drifted more into the, I would say, mainstream Orthodox world of Rabbi Soloveitchik and YU, and Heschel became less of a thinker in my mind, and kind of Rabbi Soloveitchik took such a strong pull. I mean, coming back to Heschel, which I've done later in life and spent quite a bit of time with, his ideas have really profoundly impacted me. Because what is Judaism? I'm a rabbi. I teach in yeshiva. I teach students from all over the world. And what am I teaching? Like, what exactly is it that's uniquely Jewish? What is it that is the language that we have to impart to the world? What exactly, there's so many wonderful ideas out there in the world, but what do we offer? What does Torah offer to the outside world? And I think that Rabbi Heschel really, not only in his life, obviously that's so true, but in his thought, which is so profound and has impacted me incredibly the past 5 years, I would say, where I've tried to reread all his works. What is authentically Jewish? And I think that that's such an important question to ask whenever we approach any idea in the world. Are we doing Jewish? Are we thinking Jewishly? What does that mean? And for me, the question is profound. His results are very moving, and Baruch Hashem, it's been a real impact on my life, and hopefully it'll impact my students as well.
In his last visit in Israel, only a few months before his death, Heschel delivered his speech, A Time for Renewal. These were his last words to the Israelis. We Jews are messengers who forgot the message. How to recall the message, how to proclaim it, how to live it. This is a golden hour in Jewish history. Young people are waiting, craving, searching for spiritual meaning, and our leadership is unable to respond, to guide, to illumine, with Zion as evidence and inspiration, as witness and example, a renewal of our people could come about. End of quote. However, in the winter of 1973, the Israelis discovered that they failed to understand the meaning of Zion, that the great inspiration of the 6 Days War became a hubris. The spiritual consequences were radical. Many young seculars decided to fight against any religious inspiration and created the new left wing, while many young modern Orthodox decided to force the Israeli society to find inspiration by the settlements, the new right wing. Instead of recalling the message, Israel forgot Heschel. I was born in the 70s to a young modern Orthodox couple who went to build the settlements. I had a wonderful childhood, but then came the Intifada and all my yas was filled with stones and Molotov cocktails. My parents told me that it is a sign for our idealism, that we are the greatest messengers of Zionism. However, only a few months after I graduated high school, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated, and my world crashed. I felt that my Jewishness killed my Israeliness. After a journey of years in Hesder Yeshivot, I met Heschel, in his words, and he changed my life. He told me, "You are a messenger who forgot his message. You hold the map of Judaism in your hands, but you misunderstand it because you lost your direction, because you hold the map upside down." I suddenly understood that I created a God in the image of Zionism and Orthodoxy, instead of opening my soul, my religion, and my nationality to God who created all human beings in his image. I thought that God works for the Jews. Heschel taught me that the Lord of Israel is in search of all human beings. Since then, I am dedicated to bringing Heschel's message to the Israelis. I translate his works, I teach his Torah, and in short, I try to help him make Aliyah. I am not sure if I will succeed to save Israel from racism, to remind the Israelis who is the Lord of Israel. But maybe at least, as the prophet Yechezkel said, "V'yed'u ki navi haya betocham," that Heschel has been among them.
Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, is quoted as saying, "The beginning of prayer is praise. The power of worship is song. To worship is to join the cosmos in praising God. Prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive, unless it seeks to overthrow and ruin the pyramids of callousness, hatred, opportunism, falsehoods. The liturgical movement must become a revolutionary movement, seeking to overthrow the forces that continue to destroy the promise, the hope, the vision." I love this quote from Heschel. I love this quote from Heschel because I love davening. I love davening because it's a way to connect to God. It's a way to connect to Am Yisrael. It is a way to reflect on my values. It is a way to ground myself in my broader purpose. I love davening. But I also love davening and brachot because of what Heschel said here, that it is subversive. that it is a revolutionary movement when we daven, because we are actually working to uproot the callousness within us, that each of us has blind spots, each of us has vices, bad midot, each of us has our avoda, each of us has our spiritual work to do to continue to grow spiritually and morally and Jewishly in all ways possible. And indeed, we live in a messy, broken world of injustice, of evil, of mean-spirited attacks, of all types of hate. And we need to protest those. But not only do we need to protest those out in the street, we need to protest those within our own hearts. Because each of us has teshuvah to do. Each of us has ways to grow. And davening, for Heschel, as he says here, is a chance for us to break open a little bit, to crack open the darkness and pour some light in there, and to do the work of seeing our potentiality so that we can bring light to dark spaces. I experience this in my work every day. We need to bring Torah to the streets. We need to bring spirituality to all we do, not just to the Beit Knesset, not just to the places where we pray in a minyan, but we need to make sure that that prayer works. It works in a way that it transforms us, so that we can bring this God consciousness out into the streets. A God consciousness about the Rabbona Sha'olam up in Shemayim, but also the God consciousness of the Tselem Elokim, the godliness within every human being that demands of us a spiritual revolution towards empathy and towards working for kindness and justice. I'm grateful to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel for all he wrote, but in particular, this piece of Torah, which helps me to think about not just saying prayer, but being a prayer.
So I think that Abraham Heschel's greatest contribution as a theologian, as a thinker, was to come to teach us that we know God through experience or through encounter. In other words, not the medieval attempt to prove God by reason, which was still very popular, or for that matter, the early modern trying to prove God as the great watchmaker, the great, by the argument from nature and design, the God who sets the world in motion, kind of thing. Rather, to him, it was, this is the wrong way. God is encountered in the depth of life. Religion itself is a way of living. It's an experience of existence. It's not just an intellectual or a legal or any other kind of construction. So the truth is, he taught us, that's another thing he taught, you experience life, you experience the world with what he called radical amazement, meaning you see the wonder, you don't take it for granted, it's not routine physical. If you experience it with radical amazement, then you will see many phenomena that are sacred and holy, and many moments that you will encounter God. In fact, much of his writing was sort of less intellectually structured and more like poetry, designed to give you the flavor and the feeling of a religion and of encounter God, not just talk about it. And of course, I believe to do that and that whole emphasis really reflected his own Hasidic background, very rich Hasidic background. He lived it, grew up in it, smicha in it, and never turned his back on it, even though he lived in a modern and post-Hasidic society. The quote I would like to share, the quote from him that I'd like to share with you, the road to the sacred leads through the secular. And what I think he means by that is two things. Again, first of all, that religion is in the depth of life. And therefore, when they say the road to the sacred, nature, a sunrise, a sunset, a starry night, magnificent, waves of the ocean and so on. In nature, one experiences, it seems to be a secular activity, but it's not. If you experience it with amazement, you experience the God who underlies it and who has created it. And not just in nature, I would say, in human, if you study the biological human systems, they're amazing, they're wonders. Or for that matter, in great music or great art, one can encounter, one is filled with the love and embrace of life, and in that moment, one can also encounter God. So the so-called secular activity is one of the best ways of coming. There's not going to a formal place set aside at shul, but going to see these kinds of experiences, and if you open to those experiences, don't live them superficially, you will encounter God. The second way he means that the secular leads to the sacred, I think, was his point that the Torah is not just about God and worship of God, it's about Enod L'Chavero. It's got a very strong component of Mishpat Tzedakah, meaning justice and righteousness. It's got a very strong emphasis on social justice, helping the poor, helping the oppressed, helping the outsider, the ger, the vulnerable. And of course, he felt this very strong and practiced it. And it is well known, his strong support for the civil rights movement in the 60s. He marched with Martin Luther King, showing strong support for him. And that support, the famous march from Selma to Montgomery, a march which I believe Rabbi Saul Berman also participated in. He in that famous march, he once said that the march itself was a form of prayer. In fact, it has this wonderful line, when I walked in Selma, I felt like my legs were praying. And in a way, it's Kol Atzmosai Tomarna, Hashem Kamocha. All my limbs declare God who is like you, God's presence in life. In this case, the limbs that were walking and working for justice were also connecting us to God. So I would close with one other comment. So I'm so proud and happy that YCT is sponsoring this encounter with Abraham Heschel. In my generation, and I regret to say this, many Orthodox Jews avoided him as part of that sectarian Haredization process because he was a professor at Jewish Theological Seminary, which is a conservative rabbinic seminary. But Heschel himself was completely observant, completely Shomer Mitzvah, completely God intoxicated and committed. He was teaching people to observe. He was teaching people to live the religious life. So the point is, the Torah, his Torah, transcends denomination. And for that matter, YCT's Torah, and that's part of its greatness, transcends denomination. And therefore reaches out and is proud to learn from every Jew who embraces the whole Torah and exemplifies it, particularly a person of Heschel's caliber. So I think it's very important that we show that our Torah includes the whole Jewish people and not just a narrow sectarian version of Orthodoxy. I'll close with a quote from him, nevertheless, if I can. Again, capturing this combination. A religious man, he says, is one who holds God and man in one thought at one time, but at all times. One who suffers harm done to others. One whose greatest passion is compassion, whose greatest strength is love and defiance of despair.
One of my favorite quotes from Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel as well, giving us a sense of hope and of understanding that our Jewish tradition can allow us to embrace and bring something very special to the entire world. Speaking of bringing special things to the entire world, I want to tell you that we're going to release these recordings soon. Various pieces will be coming out in the near future, so stay tuned to your inboxes. If you register for the program, you will receive a follow-up as well. They will be available on the YCT website in the near future so people can continue to learn. There was a lot here tonight, and there's a lot to think about and to digest and to be inspired by. And so I want to encourage us all to continue to be inspired by this legacy, this amazing prophetic legacy, someone who passed away too young, and to continue to think about how we can apply that legacy to bring his Torah to our lives and the ways in which we embrace and encounter the world around us. I also want to make one final thank you to Matthew Scheinberg, who's been working behind the scenes all night and dealt perfectly with a number of small issues that we had along the way and helped us get back on track. So thank you, Matthew. I saw you wave to say you're welcome. So thank you very, very much. And finally, to conclude tonight, I'll turn things over to YCT's president and Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Dov Windsor. We have to ask him to unmute. Just give us 1 second.
Thank you. So much has been said, and it's quite late, so I really don't want to take
more of anyone's time, but except to say the one thing that Rabbi Yonah Berman is not going to say, which is to express my deep gratitude, the Yeshiva's deep gratitude. I hope I speak for everybody here, our deep gratitude for Rabbi Berman, for your having had the idea, the vision of doing something in honor of Heschel's 50th yard site, and you're pushing for it, and you're doing all the work along the way from seeing this vision into reality. And I don't think any of us could have imagined a night that was this multifaceted and brought in so many voices and was inspiring and educational in so many ways. There were actually over 1,000 people who registered for this event. In the end, about 500 participated, which is mind-boggling. And this really, Rabbi Yonah, is all thanks to you and to your vision and to your dedication. So I really want to thank you for everything that you do for the yeshiva, everything that you have done, you do for Klal Yisrael. So thank you so much. And I'll end also by saying, and I think I really echo here what Hurwitz said, which is, it to some people seemed strange that YCT was doing a event on Heschel, who was associated more with the conservative movement, to the point that we actually got some pushback from some people. It's not appropriate for an Orthodox institution to be doing an event on Heschel. And Rabbi Berman, of course, you understood, because it's true to the ethos of what YCT is about. And as we just heard that Hurwitz spoke about, that a Torah vision that is one that brings life and meaning and expansiveness to our lives. That is what Orthodoxy, I would say, is so desperately in need of. And it is those that want to limit it to, to build walls, to be constrictive, to say that we only have the formal observance and nothing else, that I think speaks to a real problem. And I think that this evening spoke to what we deeply understand is what we have to do, is we have to believe in a Torah that is expansive, that welcomes voices, that brings life to our life, that brings real energy and vibrancy to our life, that brings a poetry to what so often is the prose of our life. So thank you, Rav Yonah, and thank you for having the vision, for making this possible, and thank you all for your active and enthusiastic participation. We hope you'll be able to participate in future events of YCT in the future. Laila Tov.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful night and continue to spread this wonderful vision to the world. Laila Tov.